Hello and welcome to the Uncultured Nerd Show. My name is Maven. I'm an uncultured nerd who also occasionally likes to rewind to my childhood. In my last childhood rewind, I rewatched the 2008 film version of Spiderwick Chronicles, which adapted a book series which I absolutely adored growing up, and honestly, it did a pretty good job. Something I did not think the next adaptation would be. Yes, this past week, the new Spiderwick TV show dropped on Roku to less than stellar critical reviews, but a decent audience score. So I'm actually a little more optimistic about this because sometimes the critics are wrong, and maybe this show is more for fans of the book than high-end snooty critics. True, the trailer made it look like it was not going to be very faithful to the series, and the cast list seemed like it dropped a lot of characters and added a bunch of new ones, but that does not automatically mean it's going to be bad. It just usually means it's going to be bad. But hey, maybe this will be one of the rare exceptions. So let's load this thing up, and because it is finals week, let's dive in with a very broad recap. This is the Grace family, and they just moved into their ancestral home so that Jared can see a shrink to deal with his issues, but the shrink is actually an ogre in disguise who's trying to get his hands on the hidden pages of a field guide which their crazy aunt hid all over town. The ogre has a teenage girl sidekick, Mallory has a fencing subplot, Jared makes friends at his group therapy, and the whole mission is to find the pages of the field guide around town before Mulgrath and his henchmen can. So yeah, that's the overall broad premise of the show, and after watching the first 3 episodes, I have thoughts. I guess I'll start by saying I was absolutely delighted by some elements of the show, but they were few and far between. Here's the thing. I think this could have been a good show. There are parts that work, but so much of it was just handled in weird ways that didn't make a whole ton of sense, and it's a little hard to describe, but I'm gonna try. Let's start by just looking at this as a standalone show without comparisons to the book. From that point of view, it's a mix of painfully generic stories and characters with some pretty good villains and occasional good scenes scattered throughout. It feels like all the effort in writing, directing, and acting went into the villain scenes because, oh my god, the acting from the main family is so bad. I obviously don't know if this is a directing, editing, or just a case of bad actors, but I never once bought these 4 as a family or even as real people. Their delivery on lines always feels like they're trying to remember dialogue they just read, and personality-wise, they are all such blank slates. Everyone keeps talking about how different Simon and Jared are supposed to be, but they act and sound pretty much exactly the same. They say Mallory is a fierce warrior, but that doesn't come across at all. I can hear her trying to get it across, but the delivery always falls very flat. The only one who is sort of passable is the mom, but honestly, she's still a pretty generic, nice mother figure without a whole lot more to her. But to be clear, it's not just an acting issue. Not a ton of personality seems to have been written into the characters from the start, and a lot of these lines aren't exactly the easiest to make sound natural. And just a lot of it feels like a first or second draft which was rushed out to meet a deadline with a thought of coming back later for polishing, but that polishing never happened. The side characters are also very hit and miss. Amiko and Hatcher are stereotypical, quirky sidekicks, but the actors do a good job and their lines occasionally get a laugh. And Lucinda is by far the best, probably because her actress is one of the more experienced in the cast, but also because her character struggles and motivations are mostly believable. Aside from those 3, though, there's not much in terms of complexity. Brie basically is a carbon copy of every Disney Channel original movie Mean Girl ever. Her dad is just a douche. The fencing teacher, I'll get into that more later, but they needed someone at least 50 years older for that part, and the other townspeople who show up weirdly directed, and every line feels like the first take without any rehearsal. But like I said, by far the best part of the show are the villains, kinda to a fault actually. Their scenes are so stylistically different in editing, acting, and directing that I feel like someone else took over production just for their scenes, which just makes the contrast with the rest of the show so jarring. Whenever they show up, it almost feels like we stepped into Xena Warrior Princess. It's not Oscar material, and I'm shocked there's any set left from how much scenery they're chewing, but it suddenly gets really fun. The rest of the show, it isn't even awful, it's just very generic, but when these 2 show up, I'm ready to laugh and enjoy myself at their weird antics. It's also the only time I see any really dark elements working well in the story. They straight up just eat a cat in one of their first scenes. That's the kind of creepy but also kind of funny stuff I love, and I really wish the rest of the show did more of that. Overall, the show was just kind of bland and sometimes felt very amateurish. But the villain scenes did do quite a lot of heavy lifting to bring some enjoyment out of the material. For the first 3 episodes I watched, I'd maybe give it a 5 out of 10, but again, that's without judging it as an adaptation. Because when that context is brought back in, I get kinda mad and very confused. So how did Spiderwick 2024 do with adapting the original book series? Awful. Just absolutely terrible. Honestly, if you changed the character names and called the field guide a handbook or something like that, I don't think I'd be able to tell that this was supposed to be a Spiderwick adaptation. I'd maybe think it took some inspiration with the concept of the invisible fairy world, but apart from that, pretty much everything has changed. Honestly, nothing really feels like Spiderwick, and I have a very unsupported theory as to why. Recently, me and my brother watched the Artemis Fowl movie, the adaptation of a book series we both basically have memorized, and we absolutely hated it. Not only was it just a terrible movie on its own, but it pretty much had nothing to do with the book, apart from some very out-of-place line-for-line scenes scattered throughout. The conclusion we came to was that the script did not start out as an adaptation of Artemis Fowl. It was just so different and basically had no connection to the books, we figured that there had just been a spec script with similarities to Artemis Fowl which Disney took, inserted some scenes from the book, and shot out a movie. That's honestly what this Spiderwick series kind of feels like. It's a bit better in quality, but still, that's how it feels. And I know last time I went on and on about how it's often a good thing when adaptations make changes, but at some point, you still have to refer back to the original as a foundation, and at most, the original books for this show feel like minor footnotes. And I'll make my own footnote here to say that this is based on the first 3 episodes, and I will be doing a follow-up after finals are over to see if things change, but it's hard to imagine that somehow the show will miraculously change course entirely and become like the books, because literally everything is different. Every storyline and character arc is different, character personalities are different, character motivations are different, catalyst events are different, completely new side characters are added, the rules of the fairy world are different, and at some point I just have to think, what's the point of making a Spiderwick show if you're gonna make this many completely unnecessary changes? And the theoretical answer to my question is because they had an existing fantasy script which, if tweaked enough, could be marketed as an existing IP, and existing IPs are more marketable than original concepts. So that's my theory as to what happened, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that this script did start as a Spiderwick adaptation. Again, I have to ask, what's the point of adapting it if you're going to make this many changes? These aren't minor changes either, and also aren't changes to fit the medium change like the movie had. These are foundational story and character changes which just make it unrecognizable as an adaptation. And they seem so unnecessary a lot of the time. Like, for example, Mallory has a B-plot about her trying to convince a fencing teacher to train her. Why not just expand on the glanced over side plot in the book about her proving herself on her school's new fencing team? Mulgrath is disguised as a human shrink throughout the show and is always on screen. That is so different in so many ways, and it's actually just the complete opposite of what Mulgrath was in the book. In the book, he was an unknown evil force. What made him scary was that we didn't know what he looked like and only heard from others about the fear they had for him. It's like replacing Sauron in Lord of the Rings with Hades from Disney's Hercules, which honestly, I would totally watch. And like I said, just in the context of the show, Mulgrath is actually the best character, but I don't see how someone could take what was in the books and come up with this as an interpretation. At that point, just make an original character. The only thing which changed from book to show, which I actually think was a good adaptive choice, was Lucinda. The Lucinda we see in the book and the movie is very aware of how she sounds and what people think of her. She knows how crazy she looks and goes along with people's concerns while still having a firm grasp on reality. This Lucinda is teetering on the edge. She has lost any concept of time, needs to constantly remind herself she's not crazy, and goes back and forth between coherent and rambling madness. Now this seems really different, but the character remains rooted in the original concept and makes me think more deeply about the book's interpretation. Lucinda in the book was probably the best case scenario she could have been given the circumstances. Her father abandoned her, she grew up seeing fairies who she couldn't prove to anyone were real, other fairies tortured her for information, and she eventually got locked up and was probably told all the time how crazy she was. The fact that she remained in stable mental health by the time we see her in the book is pretty much a miracle now that I think about it. This Lucinda is the worst case scenario with that same backstory. They didn't specify exactly what happened, yet it still seems her father disappeared, Mulgrath was still after her, and she was still constantly told the fairies she saw all around her were signs of her going insane. The state she is in by the time we meet her in the show is honestly plausible, still able to be rooted comfortably back to the books for inspiration. Also, like with the villains, she brings many darker elements to the show, just in psychological ways instead of with violence. Which, again, I wish were present throughout the rest of the series. But apart from Lucinda, nothing about this show is rooted to the books. To reiterate my original issue with this as an adaptation, if you're going to go this different, why not just make it an original property? This didn't need to be labeled under the Spiderwick brand, it could have just been its own thing. Like I said, the best part of the show is honestly the part which has changed the most, and that's the villains. Christian Slater is obviously having the time of his life in the evil scenes and does a great job switching personas when he's being the deceptive good version. Calliope as well is a fantastic character. The actress is great and her chemistry with Christian Slater is immediately believable. They are legitimately intimidating, funny, and appropriately mysterious in all their scenes. Which is why it sucks that they are surrounded by this bland cloud of generic. The whole family feels like blank slates, so the audience can project whatever characteristics they want onto them. The side characters are pretty much two-dimensional cardboard cutout stereotypes. It's just all so unoriginal and really does feel like Disney Channel trying to be Riverdale. So those are my overall thoughts. After I defend my thesis, I'm going to celebrate by binging the rest of the series, but unless it turns out that the first 3 episodes were a dream and they completely start over, I doubt many of the adaptive problems I have will be fixed. But maybe the overall quality with the acting and the directing will get better as the series progresses. I don't have high hopes, but we'll see. And that's about it for this episode of the Uncultured Nerd Show. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all after I finally get my degree. See y'all later.